The longest and most severe coronavirus lockdown in the world, at least to date, has been in Wuhan, China, right? It was the home of the first big outbreak. It lasted more than 10 weeks. It was very, very strict, much stricter than what we had here in the US. But we're entering like week 8 here in New York. And look, the lesson here is at a certain point, you cannot just keep people sheltered in place for an indefinite period of time, right? So the question becomes, okay, well then how do you slowly re-emerge into the world cautiously and safely by understanding the spectrum of risk you face? And crucially, learning how to distinguish between higher risk and lower risk activities, right? In a great new piece in The Atlantic called Quarantine Fatigue is Real, epidemiologist Julia Marcus writes, in essence, this is the harm reduction model, which recognizes that some people are going to take risks, whether public health experts want them to or not, and instead of condemnation, offers them strategies to reduce any potential harms. And joining me now is the author of that piece, Julia Marcus, an infectious disease epidemiologist and assistant professor of population medicine at Harvard Medical School. I really like the piece, Doctor. Let me first, I guess, start with this, which is how should we be thinking broadly about moving from a kind of like binary, you call it abstinence only, right? Like we're all going to be at home, you don't leave your house, to a spectrum of risk so that we're avoiding high risk situations and not putting people in danger?
Yeah, I think what we really need is public health guidance that can give people a sense of that spectrum of risk. And if you think about it with the abstinence only analogy, if we don't give people a sense of lower risk activities, they may have sex anyway and know how to reduce their risk. And so what we need here is a more nuanced approach to this that gives people a sense of what may be lower risk, but more sustainable in the long term.
You talked about shame, which I thought was interesting, because shame has been a sort of shame is an interesting tool of sort of social mobilization. And I sort of feel the same way. Like, I'm not really into shaming people that are doing the wrong thing, mostly because I don't like shaming people generally. But it also does seem like it is an important thing that we're doing here is we're sort of communally establishing norms. And shame is one of the ways you establish norms, right? It's one of the ways that you say, like, what is and isn't passable etiquette, what is and isn't polite for doing something. If you walk down the street, like with your no pants on, like that's against the law, but mostly it's just like a shameful thing that other people will look badly at. And at some level, you want to sort of create that for things like masks. Like, what is the role that you see for shame or not in this conversation?
Well, I'm an HIV prevention researcher, and we know from decades of HIV research that shaming people doesn't necessarily have the effect that we want it to have. It may feel good in the moment, and it may give us a sense of control to shame somebody else's behaviors, and it may make us angry to see someone doing something that we think is putting themselves and, importantly, other people at risk. But the reality is that when we shame individuals and their behaviors, what ends up happening is those behaviors just get driven underground where we can't address them at all. So it ends up backfiring in the end.
So what are the big lessons here? I thought it when you talk about things being driven underground, right? I mean, there are certain things that seem like we know these are super risky kinds of things. Like if you have a big, like, closely held house dance party with like a few hundred people in a small confined space, like that's a really bad idea. But if you go and visit a few friends in a park and sit around each other, that's probably much better. Like how do we think about telling people what they should be doing?
Ideally, we'd have public health guidance at a national level that would be giving us that sense of a spectrum of risk. And so with that guidance, rather than having a house party, somebody might say, oh, you know what? I actually can gather with my friends. I should just do it outside and I should wear a mask. And at this point, what we have is this kind of binary approach that's either stay at home indefinitely or go back to business as usual. But risk is not binary. There's a lot in between there that we need to be communicating as health experts to the public. And right now, we're not really hearing that at a national level. So my hope is that state and local health departments are going to step in and fill that space.
It does seem to me that the outdoor-indoors binary is a fairly big one in terms of the way that we're understanding risk of transmission here. There's been a lot of sort of writing by public health experts, like let people go to parks, let people go outdoors. Like people do need, for mental health, for physical health, for social health, like people do need to get out of the house. And everything that the data we have on the virus suggests that like in the spectrum of risk, outdoors superior to indoors.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a new virus, so we're still learning about it. But based on early studies of the epidemiology of this virus, it really seems like the highest risk settings are enclosed, crowded indoor settings where people have prolonged close contact with other people. And so outdoors in general is going to be much lower risk. And then even within outdoor settings, we can redesign our outdoor spaces to create more space, open up streets for people to have recreational activities where they can keep more distance from each other. There really are ways to restructure everything around us to promote physical distancing in a way that's going to be sustainable in the long term.
But the point you make is so crucial, which is that like we do need some guidance other than like, you know, cable news host segments from like people saying like, look, these are the spectrums of risks. This is how we can understand this framework, and this is how we can keep people we love safe and our society safe while also not like completely losing our minds indoors indefinitely. Julia Marcus, who wrote that great piece in The Atlantic that really kind of changed my thinking on this. Thanks for making time tonight.